From a very early period of my life, the entire bent of my inclinations had been toward microscopic investigations. When I was not more than 10 years old, a distant relative of our family, hoping to astonish my inexperience, constructed a simple microscope for me by drilling in a disc of copper a small hole in which a drop of pure water was sustained by capillary attraction. This very primitive apparatus, magnifying some 50 diameters, presented, it is true, only indistinct and imperfect forms, but still sufficiently wonderful to work up my imagination to preternatural state of excitement. Seeing me so interested in this rude instrument, what my cousin explained to me all that he knew about the principles of the microscope, related to me a few of the wonders which had been accomplished through its agency, and ended by promising to send me one regularly constructed immediately on his return to the city. I counted the days, the hours, the minutes that intervened between that promise and his departure. Meantime, I was not idle. Every transparent substance that bore the remotest resemblance to a lens I eagerly seized upon and employed in vain attempts to realize that instrument, the theory of whose construction I as yet only vaguely comprehended. All panes of glass containing those aplate spherical knots, familiarly known as bull's-eyes, were ruthlessly destroyed in the hope of obtaining lenses of marvelous power. I even went so far as to extract the crystalline humor from the eyes of fishes and animals, and endeavored to press it into the microscopic service. I pled guilty to having stolen the glasses from my Aunt Agatha's spectacles, with a dim idea of grinding them into lenses of wondrous magnifying properties, in which attempt it scarcely necessary to say that I totally failed. At the last promised instrument came. It was the one that order known as Field's simple microscope, and had cost perhaps about $15. As far as educational purposes went, a better apparatus could not have been selected. Accompanying it was a small treatise on the microscope, its history, uses, and discoveries. I comprehended then, for the first time, the Aberrarian night's entertainments. The dull veil of ordinary existence that hung across the world seemed suddenly to roll away, and to lay bare a land of enchantments. I felt toward my companions as the seer might feel toward the ordinary masses of men. I held conversations with nature in a tongue which they could not understand. I was in daily communication with living wonders, such as they never imagined in their wildest visions. I penetrated beyond the external portal of things and roamed through the sanctuaries, where they behold only a drop of rain, slowly rolling down the window glass. I saw a universe of beings animated with all the passions common to physical life, and convulsing their minute sphere with struggles as fierce and protracted as those of men. In the common spots of mold, which my mother, good housekeeper that she was, fiercely scooped away from her jam pots, there abode for me, under the name of the mildew, enchanted gardens filled with dells and avenues of the densest foliage and most astonishing verdure, while from the fantastic boughs of these microscopic forests hung strange fruits glittering with green, silver, and gold. It was no scientific thirst that at this time filled my mind. It was the pure enjoyment of a poet, to whom a world of wonders had been disclosed. I talked of my solitary pleasures to none. Alone with my microscope, I dimmed my sight day after day and night after night, poring over the marvels which it unfolded to me. I was like one who, having discovered the ancient Eden still existing in all its primitive glory, should resolve to enjoy it in solitude and never betray to mortal the secret of its locality. The rod of my life was bent at this moment. I destined myself to be a microscopist. Of course, like every novice, I fancied myself a discoverer. I was ignorant at the time of thousands of acute intellects engaged in the same pursuit as myself, and with the advantage of instruments 1,000 times more powerful than mine. The names of Leeuwenhoek, Williamson, Spencer, Ehrenberg, Schultz, Dujardin, Schott, Schleiden were then entirely unknown to me, or if known, I was ignorant of their patient and wonderful researches. In every fresh specimen of cryptogamia which I placed beneath my instrument, I believe that I discovered wonders of which the world was as yet ignorant. I remember well the thrill of delight and admiration that shot through me the first time I discovered the common's wheel amicule, expanding and contracting its flexible spokes and seemingly rotating through the water. Alas, I grew older and attained some works treating of my favorite study. I found that only the threshold of science to the investigation of which some of the greatest men of the age were devoting their lives and intellects. As I grew up, my parents, who saw but little likelihood of anything practical resulting from the examination of bits of moss and drops of water through a brass tube and piece of glass, were anxious that I should choose a profession. It was their desire that I should enter the counting house of my uncle Ethan Blake, a prosperous merchant who carried on business in New York. The suggestion I decisively combated. I had no taste for trade. I should only make a failure, in short. I refused to become a merchant. But it was necessary for me to select some pursuit. My parents were staid New England people who insisted on necessity of labor, and therefore, although, thanks to the bequest of my poor Aunt Agatha, I should, on coming of age, inherit a small fortune sufficient to place me above want, it was decided that instead of waiting for this, I should act the nobler part, and enjoy the intervening years in rendering myself independent. After much conjugation, I complied with the wishes of my family, and selected a profession. I determined to study medicine at the New York Academy. This disposition of my future suited me. A removal from my relatives would enable me to dispose of my time as I pleased without fear of detection. As long as I paid my academy fees, I might shirk attending the lectures if I chose, and as I never had the most remote intentions of standing an examination, there was no danger of being plucked. Besides, a metropolis was the place for me. There I could obtain excellent instruments, the newest publications, intimacy with men of pursuits kindred with my own, in short, all things necessary to ensure a profitable devotion of my life to my beloved science. I had an abundance of money, few desires that were not bounded by my illuminating mirror on one side and my object glass on the other. What therefore was to prevent my becoming an illustrious investigator of the veiled worlds? It was with the most buoyant hope that I left my New England home and established myself in New York. My first step, of course, was to find suitable apartments. These I obtained after a couple days of search in 4th Avenue, a very pretty second floor, unfurnished, containing sitting room, bedroom, and a smaller apartment which I intended to fit up as a laboratory. I furnished my lodging simply but rather elegantly, and then devoted all my energies to the adornment of temple of my worship. I visited Pike, the celebrated optician, and passed in review his splendid collection of microscopes, Field's compound, Hingham Spencer's Natchez binocular, that founded on the principles of the stereoscope, and at length fixed upon the forms known as Spencer's Trinitian microscope, as combining the greatest number of improvements with an almost perfect freedom from tremor. Along with this, I purchased every possible accessory, draw tubes, micrometers, a camera lucidia, lever stage, achromatic condensers, white cloud illuminators, prisms, parabolic condensers, polarizing apparatus, forceps, aquatic boxes, fishing tubes, and had to an entire attire of the best houses in the city, taking care, however, I suppose, to drive no bargains with the enchanted circle of the upper 10. I came at length to the conclusion that this peddling was but a mask to cover some greater object. Anyone went so far as to believe my young acquaintance to be implicated in the slave trade. That, however, was none of my affair. On the present occasion, Simon entered my room in a state of considerable excitement. "Ah, mon ami," he cried, before I could even offer him the ordinary salutation. "It has occurred to me to be the witness of the most astonishing thing in the world. I promenade myself to the house of Madame. How does the little animal Le Renard name himself in the Latin?" "Vulpes," I answered. "Ah, yes, Vulpes. I promenade myself to the house of Madame Vulpes." "The spirit medium?" "Yes, the great medium. Great heavens, what a woman! I write on the slip of my paper many of questions concerning affairs of the most secret affairs that conceal themselves in the abyss of my heart, the most profound, and behold my examples. What occurs? This devil of a woman makes me replies the most truthful to all of them. She talks to me things that I do not love to talk to myself. What am I to think? Am I fixed to the earth? Am I to understand you, M. Simon, that this Mrs. Vulpes replied to questions secretly written by you, which questions related to events known only to yourself? Ah, more than that, he answered, with an air of some alarm. She related to me things, but, he added after a pause and suddenly changing his matter, why occupy ourselves with these follies? It was all the biology without a doubt. It goes without saying that is not my credence, but why are we here, mon ami? It occurred to me to discover the most beautiful thing, as you can imagine, a vase with green lizards on it, composed by the great Bernard Palissy. It is in my apartment. Let us mount. I go to show it to you. I followed Simon mechanically, but my thoughts were far from Palissy and his Emmanuel where, although I like him, was seeking in the darkness a great discovery. This casual mention of the spiritualist Madame Vulpes set me on a new track. What if this spiritualism should really be a great fact? What if through communication with more subtle organisms than my own, I could reach a single bound, the goal which perhaps a life of agonizing mental toil would never enable me to attain? While purchasing the Palissy vase for my friend Simon, I was mentally arranging a visit to Madame Vulpes. 2 evenings after this, thanks to an arrangement by letter and the promise of an ample fee, I found Madame Vulpes awaiting me at her residential alone. She was a coarse-featured woman, with keen and rather cruel dark eyes, and an exceedingly sensual expression about her mouth and under jaw. She received me in perfect silence, in an apartment on the ground floor, very sparsely furnished. In the center of the room, close to where Mrs. Vulpes sat, there was a common round mahogany table. If I had come for the purpose of sweeping her chimney, the woman could not have looked more indifferent to my appearance. There was no attempt to inspire the visitor with awe. Everything bore a simple and practical aspect. This intercourse with the spiritual world was evidently as familiar an occupation with Mrs. Vulpes as eating her dinner or riding in the omnibus. "You come here for communication with Mr. Linley," said the medium in a dry, businesslike tone of voice. "By appointment, yes." "What sort of communication do you want? A written one?" "Yes, I wish for a written one." "From any particular spirit?" "Yes." "Have you ever known this spirit on this earth?" "Never. He died long before I was born. I wish merely to obtain from him some information which he ought to be able to give better than any other." "Will you seat yourself at this table, Mr. Linley," said the medium, "and place your hands upon it?" I obeyed Mrs. Vulpes, being seated opposite to me, with her hands also on the table. We remained thus for about a minute and a half, and when a violent succession of raps came on the table, on the back of my chair, on the floor, immediately under my feet, and even on the window panes, Mrs. Vulpes smiled composedly. "They are very strong tonight," she remarked. "You are fortunate," she then continued. "Will the spirits communicate with this gentleman?" Vigorous affirmative. "Will the particular spirit he desired to speak with communicate?" A very confused rapping followed this question. "I know what they mean," said Mrs. Vulpes, addressing herself to me. "They wish you to write down the name of the particular spirit that you desire to converse with. Is that so?" she added, speaking to her invisible guests. That it was so evident from the numerous affirmative responses, while that this was going on, I tore a slip from my pocket-book and scribbled a name under the table. "Will this spirit communicate in writing with this gentleman?" asked the medium once more. After a moment's pause, her hand seemed to be seized with a violent tremor, shaking so forcibly that the table vibrated. She said that the spirit had seized her hand and would write. I handed her some sheets of paper that were on the table and pencil. The latter she held loosely in her hand, which presently began to move over the paper with a singular and seemingly involuntary motion. After a few moments had elapsed, she handed me the paper on which I had found written in a large, uncultivated hand the words, "He is not here, but has been sent for." A pause of a minute or so ensued, during which Mrs. Volupes remained perfectly silent, but the raps continued at regular intervals. When the short period I mentioned had elapsed, the hand of the medium was again seized with its convulsive tremor. As she wrote under this strange influence a few words on the paper which she handed to me, they were as follows: "I am here. Question me. Loanoic." I was astounded. The name was identical with that I had written beneath the table, and carefully kept concealed. Neither was it at all probable that an uncultivated woman like Mrs. Vulpes should know even the name of the great father of microscopies. It may have been biology, but this theory was soon doomed to be destroyed. I wrote on my slip, still concealing it from Mrs. Volpe's, a series of questions to avoid tediousness. I shall place with the responses in the order in which they occurred. I. Can the microscopes be brought to perfection? Spirit. Yes. I. Am I destined to accomplish this great task? Spirit. You are. I wish to know how to proceed to attain this end. For the love which you bear science, help me. Spirit. A diamond of 140 carats submitted to electromagnetic currents for a long period will experience a rearrangement of its atoms inter se, and from that stone will form the universal lens. I. Will great discoveries result from the use of such a lens? Spirit. So the great has all gone before it is as nothing. I. But the refractive power of the diamond is so immense that the image will be formed within the lens. How is that difficulty to be surmounted? Spirit. Pierce the lens through its axis, and the difficulty is obviated. The image will be formed in the pierced space, which will itself serve as a tube to look through. Now I am called. Good night. I cannot describe the effect that these extraordinary communications had upon me. I felt completely bewildered. No biological theory could account for the discovery of the lens. The medium might, by means of biological report with my mind, have gone so far as to read my questions and reply to them coherently. But biology could not enable her to discover the magnetic currents which so alter the crystals of the diamond as to remedy its previous defects and admit of its being polished into a perfect lens. Some such theory may have passed through my head, it is true, but if so, I had forgotten it. In my excited condition of mind, there was no course left but to become a convert, and it was in a state of the most painful nervous exaltation that I left the medium's house that evening. She accompanied me to the door, hoping that I was satisfied. The raps following us as we went through the hall, sounding on the balusters, the flooring, and even the lintels on the floor. I hastily expressed my satisfaction and escaped hurriedly into the cool night air. I walked home with but one thought possessing me: how to obtain a diamond of the immense size required. My entire means, multiplied 100 times over, would have been adequate to its purchase. Besides, such stones are rare and become historical. I could find only such in a regalia of Eastern or European monarchs. There was a light in Simon's room as I entered my house. A vague impulse urged me to visit him. As I opened the door of his sitting room unannounced, he was bending with his back toward me over a carousel lamp, apparently engaged in minutely examining some object which he held in his hands. As I entered, he started up suddenly, thrust his hand into his breast pocket, and turned to me with a face crimson with confusion. "What?" I cried. "Poring over the miniature of some fair lady? Well, don't blush so much. I won't ask to see it." Simon laughed awkwardly enough, but made none of the negative protestations usual on such occasions. He asked me to take a seat. "Simon," said I have just come from Madame Volpe's." This time Simon has turned as white as a sheet, and seemed stupefied, as if sudden electric shock had smitten him. He babbled some incoherent words, and went hastily to a small closet where he usually kept his liquors. Although astonished at his emotion, I was too preoccupied with my own idea to pay much attention to anything else. "You say truly when you call Madame Volpe's a devil of a woman," I continued. "Simon, she told me wonderful things tonight, or rather was the means of telling me wonderful things. Ah, if I can only get a hand on a diamond that weighed 140 carats. Scarcely had the sigh with I uttered this desire died upon my lips, when Simon, with the aspect of a wild beast, glared at me savagely, and rushingly to the mantelpiece, where some foreign weapons hung on the wall, caught up a malachy crest and brandished it furiously before him. "No!" he cried in French, into which he always broke when excited. "No! You shall not have it! You are perfidious! You have consulted with that demon, and desire my treasure! But I will die first! Me! I am brave! You cannot make me fear!" All this, uttered in a loud voice, trembling with excitement, astounded me. I saw at a glance that I had accidentally trodden upon the edges of Simon's secret. Whatever it was necessary to reassure him. "My dear Simon, I am entirely at loss to know what you mean. I went to Madame Volpe's to consult her on the scientific problem, to the solution of which I discovered that a diamond of the size I just mentioned was necessary. You were never alluded to during the evening, nor, so far as I were concerned, even thought of. What can be the meaning of this outburst? If you happen to have a set of valuable diamonds in your possession, you need fear nothing from me. The diamond which I require you cannot possess, or if you did possess it, you would not be living here." Something in my tone must have completely reassured him, for his expression immediately changed to a sort of constrained merriment. Combined, however, with a certain suspicious attention to my movements, he laughed and said that I must bear with him, that he was at certain moments subject to a species of vertigo, which betrayed itself in incoherent speeches, and that attacks passed off as rapidly as they came. He put his weapon aside while making this explanation, and endeavored with some success to assume a more cheerful air. All this did not impose on me in the least. I was too much accustomed to analytical labors to be baffled by so flimsy a veil. I determined to probe the mystery to the bottom. "Simon," I said gaily, "let us forget all this over a bottle of Burgundy. I have a case of Lagerais Clos Vagot downstairs, fragrant with the odors and ruddy with the sunlight of the Côte d'Or. Let us have up a couple of bottles. What say you?" "With all my heart," Simon answered, smiling. I produced the wine, and we seated ourselves to a drink. It was of the famous vintage of that of 1848, a year when war and wine throve together, and its pure but powerful juice seemed to impart renewed vitality to the system. By the time we had half finished the second bottle, Simon's head, which I knew was a weak one, had begun to yield, while I remained calm as ever. Only that ever draught seemed to send a flush of vigor through my limbs. Simon's utterance became more and more indistinct. He took to singing French chansons of a not very moral tendency. I rose suddenly from the table just at the conclusion of one of those incoherent verses, and fixing my eyes on him with a quiet smile, said, "Simon, I have deceived you. I learned your secret this evening. You may as well be frank with me. Mrs. Volpe's, or rather one of her spirits, told me all." He started with horror. His intoxication seemed for the moment to fade away, and he had a movement toward the weapon that he had a short time before laid down. I stopped him with my hand. "Monster!" he cried passionately. "I am ruined! What shall I do? You shall never have it! I swear by my mother!" "I don't want it," I said. "Rest secure, but be frank with me. Tell me all about it." The drunkenness began to return. He protested with maudlin earnestness that I entirely mistaken, that I was intoxicated, then asked me to swear eternal secrecy and promised to disclose the mystery to me. I pledged myself, of course, to all. With an uneasy look in his eyes and hands unsteady with drink and nervousness, he drew a small case from his breast and opened it. Heavens! Now how the mild lamplight was shivered into 1,000 prismatic arrows as it fell upon a vast rose diamond that glittered in that case. I was no judge of diamonds, but I saw at a glance that this was a gem of rare size and purity. I looked at Simon with wonder, and I must confess it. With impurity, I looked at Simon with wonder, and how could he have attained this treasure? In reply to my questions, I could just gather from his drunken statements, of which I fancy half the incoherence was affected, that he had been superintending a gang of slaves, engaged a diamond, washing in Brazil, that he had seen one of them, a secret diamond, but instead of informing his employers, had quietly watched the Negro until he saw him bury his treasures, that he had dug it up and fled with it, but that as yet he was afraid to attempt to dispose of it publicly, so as a valuable gem being almost certain to attract too much attention to its owner's tendencies, and he had not been able to discover any of those obscure channels by which such matters are conveyed away safely. He added that in accordance with Oriental practice he had named his diamond with the fanciful title of the Eye of Morning. While Simon was relating this to me, I regarded the great diamond attentively. Never had I beheld anything so beautiful. All the glories of light ever imagined or described seemed to pulsate in crystalline chambers. Its weight, as I learned from Simon, was exactly 140 carats. Here was an amazing coincidence that a hand of destiny seemed in it. On the very evening when the spirit of Luino communicates to me the great secret of the microscope, that priceless means which he directs me to employ start up within my easy reach, I determined with the most perfect deliberation to possess myself of Simon's diamond. I sat opposite of him while he nodded over his glass and calmly resolved the whole affair. I did not for an instant contemplate so foolish an act as common theft, which would of course be discovered, or at least necessitate flight and concealment, all of which must interfere with my scientific plans. There was but one step to be taken: to kill Simon. After all, what was the life of a little peddling Jew in comparison with the interest of science? Human beings are taken every day from the condemned prisons to be experimented on by surgeons. This man, Simon, was by his own confession a criminal, a robber, and I believed on my soul a murderer. He deserves death quite as much as any felon condemned by the laws. Why should I not, like the government, contrive that his punishment should be contribute to the progress of human knowledge? That means for accomplishing everything I desired lay within my reach. There stood upon the mantelpiece a bottle half full of French laudanum. Simon was so occupied with his diamond, which I had just restored to him, that it was an affair of no difficulty to drug his glass. In a quarter of an hour he was in a profound sleep. I now opened his waistcoat, took the diamond from the inner pocket in which he had placed it, and removed him to bed, on which I laid him so that his feet hung down over the edge. I had possessed myself on the Malay crease, which I held in my right hand, while with the other I discovered as accurately as I could by pulsation the exact locality of the heart. It was as accurately as I could by pulsation the exact locality of the heart. It was essential that all aspects of his death should lead to the surmise of self-murder. I calculated the exact angle at which it was probable that the weapon, if leveled by Simon's own hand, would enter his breast. Then, with one powerful blow, I thrust it up into the hilt in its very spot which I desired to penetrate. A convulsive thrill ran through Simon's limbs. I heard a smothered sound issue from his throat, precisely like the bursting of a large air bubble sent up by a diver when it reaches the entire surface of the water. He turned half round on his side, and as if to assist my plans more efficiently, his right hand, moved by some mere spasmodic impulse, clasped the handle of the crease. There was no apparent struggle. The laudanum, as I presume, paralyzed usual nervous actions. He must have died instantly. There was yet something to be done, to make it certain that all suspicious of the act should be diverted from any inhabitant to the house of Simon himself. It was necessary that the door should be found in the morning, locked on the inside. How to do this and afterwards escape myself? Not by the window, that was a physical impossibility. Besides, I was determined that the windows also should be found bolted. The solution was simple enough. I descended softly to my own room for a particular instrument which I had used for holding small, slippery substances, such as minute spears of glass, etc. This instrument was nothing more than a long, slender hand vase with a very powerful grip and considerable leverage, which last was accidentally owing to the shape of the handle. Nothing was simpler than when the key was in the lock to seize the end of it and stem it in the vise, through the keyhole from the outside, and so to lock the door. Previously, however, to doing this, I burned a number of papers on Simon's hearth. Suicides almost always burn papers before they destroy themselves. I also emptied some more laudanum into Simon's glass, having first removed from all its traces of wine, cleaned the other wine glass, and brought the bottles away with me. If traces of 2 persons drinking had been found in the room, the question naturally would have arisen: who was the second? Besides, the wine bottles might have been identified as belonging to me. The laudanum I poured out to the account for its presence in his stomach in case of post-mortem examination. The theory naturally would be that he first intended to poison himself, but after swallowing a little of the drug was either disgusted with its taste or changed his mind from other motives and chose the dagger. These arrangements made, I walked out, leaving the gas burning, locked the door with my vise, and went to bed. Simon's death was not discovered until nearly 3 in the afternoon. The servant, astonished at seeing the gas burning, the light steaming on the dark, landing from under the pour, peeped through the keyhole and saw Simon on the bed. She gave the alarm. The door burst open, and the neighborhood was in fever of excitement. Everyone in the house was arrested, myself included. There was inquest, but no clue to his death beyond that of suicide could be obtained. Curiously enough, he had made several speeches to his friends that preceding that week that seemed to point to no self-destruction. One gentleman swore that Simon had said in his presence that he was tired of life. His landlord affirmed that Simon, when paying him last month's rent, remarked that he should not pay him rent much longer. All other evidence corresponded: the door locked inside, the position of the corpse, the burned papers. As I anticipated, no one knew of the possessions of the diamond by Simon, so that no motive was suggested for his murder. The jury, after a prolonged examination, brought in the usual verdict, and the neighborhood once more settled down to its accustomed quiet. The 3 months succeeding Simon's catastrophe I devoted night and day to my diamond lens. I had constructed a vast galvanic battery composed of nearly 2,000 pairs of plates. A higher power I dared not to use, lest the diamond should be calcined. By means of this enormous engine I was able to send a powerful current of electricity continually through my great diamond, which has seemed to me send gains in lustre every day. At the expiration of a month I commenced the grinding and polishing of the lens, a work of intense toil and exquisite delicacy. The great density of the stone and the care required to be taken with the curvatures of the surfaces of the lens rendered the labor the severest and most harassing that I had yet undergone.